This episode of New Politics was released on the 4th of April, 2026, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Is Australia acting in its own interests or just acting in the interests of the United States? And how much is Australia paying for following the United States at the petrol pump and in the foreign policy debate? Because if this is the direction we're heading in, it's not just foreign policy that's changing, it's the political identity of the country itself. I'm Eddie Djokovic.
I'm David Lewis. All of this is coming up in this big episode of New Politics.
And just a reminder that New Politics is produced by independent media. We publish extended analysis each and every week. And if you value independent journalism without the influence of corporate backing, join us at newpolitics.com.au and support us directly. It's just $5 per month. You can also join up at Substack and Patreon, and all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
Israeli and American planes have subjected the capital of Iran to waves of bombing. 701 strikes were recorded over 24 hours, according to one human rights group. The majority concentrated in and around Tehran. The Red Crescent Society says residential areas were hit overnight, and we see their personnel and search dogs moving through the rubble, searching for survivors and counting the dead. The Iranian Health Ministry says more than 1,900 people have died.
The war in the Western Asia, Middle East region continues, and so does the uncertainty that's surrounding the future of the world. And aside from the fact that no one really knows when this is all going to end, and Iran is proving to be a far greater opponent than Israel and the United States anticipated, this is likely to result in a far different alignment or realignment than what we've ever seen in the past in politics. And it's likely to result in a realignment that the United States will not be happy about, because the United States will more than likely no longer be positioned at the centre of the universe. But as far as I'm concerned, it's hard to hold any sympathy, because the United States has brought this on all by itself in conjunction with the ambitions of Israel. And whenever there's a problem in the world, the United States seems to be at the centre of it, whether it's in the Middle East or in Cuba, Central America, South America, Southeast Asia. Seems like the US has got a finger in every single pie. And the United States does have a lot of debt problems. It's got far too much overreach across the world. And this is consistent with historical overreach, with empires just before they collapse. And this attack on Iran is an example of that overreach, and all of this not going to plan, but it's probably going to fast track the ambitions of other countries in the world, setting up new alliances. And it might also be a case of, in the long term, Australia missing out on all of these new alliances because they've become too close to the United States and they've become too close to Donald Trump.
Paul Keating springs to mind, and he tried to reframe back in the 1990s. He tried to reframe Australian foreign affairs using the notion that it's not the Far East to us, it's the near North. Now, he didn't come out of nowhere with that. Australia had been trading and dealing with Indonesia for centuries, when you count trade in the top end with Indigenous people back before the Europeans came. But certainly the idea was that Australia was a Western nation. We just happened to be stuck in the southeast. Paul Keating tried to say maybe we should deal with our own region a bit more sensibly. And this was overturned with John Howard, of course, very quickly. And we're now seeing the results of this. We're stuck in a situation, to the credit of the government, they've not committed any ships, which was what was first asked, to the Middle East. It's not to say that they won't, but I actually do suspect that Australia, along with the rest of the world, will stay out of this one. It looks like America's lost it and is now just trying to find a way to get out without losing status or face. as someone said, actually it was Barack Obama. The two things that they wanted was control of the state of Hormuz, which they already had, and to put oil prices down, which failed horribly. I think even the most staunch supporter of Trump would have to admit that oil prices have gone up. And yeah, if you drive a diesel car or you're running a truck business or a diesel vehicle business, you are feeling it just as much than if you are driving a car. I can really see the real beneficiaries of this are going to be the electric car companies as people offload their petrol engines and diesel engines for electric engines. That's fine, of course. The only real problem is that it's the more wealthy who will be able to be advantaged by this. The poor end of town will be stuck with petrol cars and their now high running costs.
Well, I guess the other point is that, Donald Trump is being exposed with all of this, and I think that Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, he's also being politically exposed. And I don't think it's because of the one single issue. It seems to be about quite a few decisions and actions over the past 6 months or so. And it's also about the perceptions about what's going on here. And my feeling is that Anthony Albanese just hasn't distanced himself enough from Donald Trump. And you have a look at some of the other world leaders. So there's Mark Carney in Canada. Well, he turned attacking Donald Trump into an art form, and he actually won that federal election in Canada last year or the year before based on attacking Donald Trump and the United States. And you got people like Zoran Mamdani, the mayor of New York, criticised Donald Trump horribly, yet managed to have a functional relationship with him. J.D. Vance, same sort of issue, said that he would never vote for Donald Trump, highly critical of Donald Trump, yet he managed to become his vice president. But to me, it seems that Anthony Albanese, he seems to believe that having that strong one-on-one personal relationship means that you automatically get a strong national relationship. And that's not, and sure, that's a good thing to do, but it's not necessarily the case. And we also saw, whenever it was, 4 or 5 weeks ago, that Anthony Albanese was the first world leader to publicly support the United States over its attacks on Iran, and also one of the first countries to send troops to the region. It wasn't to Iran, it was to the UAE. And once you start doing this sort of thing, it's actually hard to criticise the war if you're actually a part of it. And I think the electorate or the voters in Australia are starting to connect all of these different dots. There's this global instability, the rising fuel prices, and hang on, Australia is part of this war because we sent troops over there. So it's almost like Anthony Albanese cannot blame the United States for these rising fuel prices, which is what Mark Carney is doing in Canada, which means that someone's got to get blamed for all of this. And Anthony Albanese is the one who's getting all the blame for these rising fuel prices. So then what does he do? Well, he ends up doing what any political leader does when they're under pressure. He tries to release that. So he releases the pressure, cuts the fuel excise for the next 3 months, and that costs the budget $3.2 billion. I think he cut it by 26 cents per litre and then another 6 cents. So it's been cut by 32 cents per litre. And now he also decided that he had to do a national address as well.
My fellow Australians, by nature, we're an optimistic country, but I understand that right now it's hard to be positive. The war in the Middle East has caused the biggest spike in petrol and diesel prices in history. Australia is not an active participant in this war, but all Australians are paying higher prices because of it. I know that you're seeing this at the servo and at the supermarket, and I understand farmers and truckies, small businesses and families are doing it tough. And the reality is, the economic shocks caused by this war will be with us for months. Tonight I want to speak directly with you about what the government is doing to shield Australia in these uncertain times, and also what all of us can do to help our country and help each other in the period ahead.
That sounded like a bedtime story delivered for a 4-year-old, and it's almost as soporific. Now, I guess the issue is, now the federal government might have had to cut the fuel excise at some point. But the point that I'm making is that this became the first thing that Anthony Albanese did rather than the last thing that he should have done. And it's also a sign that he's under a lot of pressure. It made the fuel excise cut, then that national address, which he didn't really need to do. It's the sort of stuff that a leader under pressure would do. But the other point is that a lot of this is self-inflicted. He's meant to be a politician. He's been in politics for 30 years and he's just not playing the politics very well.
No, it's again that notion, I think, that he's a very good manager, but he's not as strong when it comes to the extraordinary or the unexpected. On the day-to-day, he's fine. But as Harold Macmillan said, the Prime Ministership is about events, dear boy, events. And the events just keep happening. And it's a time where a Keating or a Hawke on Labor side, and even a Rudd, would have done a bit better, I think. I think, yeah, day-to-day, there's no problem. Or there's problems, but there's always problems. There's no out-of-the-ordinary problem. However, when big things happen, we're stuck with a manager rather than a leader.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Like a good political leader avoids the problem before it arises, or stamps out the problem before it arises. And I'm not saying that he could have stopped what the US government was planning to do in Iran, but you sort of anticipate these sort of things. That's the biggest skill to have in politics, anticipation, rather than waiting for these events to occur.
Yeah. You get caught. I think it was Harry Truman who said something like, we all talk about the early bird catches the worm, but no one ever talks about the late worm. And in politics, sometimes it's better to wait, hold your fire, wait, don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes type thing. But sometimes you've got to think strategically. And okay, yeah, the war came from nowhere, but it didn't really come from nowhere either. With Israel and Israel having a willing ally, an even more willing ally, it seems, than even Joe Biden was. Biden was never quite ready to commit troops. And in fact, Netanyahu was gloating that he'd been waiting 40 years for this opportunity, and finally the right president came along and gave it to him. And I think that probably says it all, really. Of course, it looks like Netanyahu may well be arrested over the next month or so because things haven't gone well. Israel is being besieged by 5 sides. And as we pointed out, or as you pointed out, the Israeli government is not dealing with it, looking at the facts and how can we fix this. They're spreading lies, as the talk at the National Press Council pointed out. There was no fact in it, or very little fact, just enough fact to make you think that the non-fact that followed must be valid.
Oh, but I guess the other issue is that a lot of people are beginning to ask, they're asking us, they're also asking in general, who's calling the shots in all of these issues? What's going on behind the scenes? And we had that very strange exchange between the Foreign Minister Penny Wong and the Australian Greens in the Senate last week.
Because the US relationship matters more than some domestic politics about environmental reform.
So Penny Wong says the US alliance is more important than environmental reform in Australia. And that's a bit rich coming from someone who was actually the Environment Minister some time ago. And a lot of this behaviour suggests that the federal government is feeling probably, feels politically comfortable. And I think they're probably too politically comfortable. They've got this large majority. They're facing a weak opposition. And these are careless statements. They're just making these careless statements and not caring too much about what the electorate will think about all of this. But even hearing that statement, I think the deeper issue is, well, what is Australia's independence in all of this? And we did get that comment from John Howard in 2001 when he said that Australia is the deputy sheriff of the United States and the Pacific. But the problem is that the deputy sheriff is always going to be controlled by the sheriff. That's how the system works. And we had that situation a few years ago where the United States was not happy about Australia's pharmaceutical benefit scheme and the Medicare scheme because, David, well, that's socialism. We can't have that sort of stuff. And I realised that, that exchange in the Senate that we played before, that's just the one rash comment that's made in a heated Senate debate. Well, I don't, maybe Penny Wong did really mean what she said there, but we're obviously tied into the United States military system. But how soon will it be before the United States starts dictating Australia's environmental policies or health policies or education or a wide range of other areas? How soon before that happens? And if it does happen, I just don't think the public will accept that.
Yeah. In many ways, we haven't got over World War II. When John Curtin turned our eyes to America free of any pangs of loyalty to the British Empire, it was because America was needed in the Pacific. Australia couldn't defeat the Japanese army by itself, and Australia couldn't really live with a circumstance of a defeated empire in Asia. Now, they did believe that the Japanese were trying to invade Australia and take it over, and there were all kinds of plans, some not so good and some worse, about how they'd manage this. We found out after the war that Japan wasn't really interested in coming into Australia because it's too big to manage, it's too spread out, it's a difficult resource to manage in that kind of way. But the fear was genuine that Japan was going to roll through New Guinea, through Darwin, down to Brisbane, down to Sydney and Perth, etc.
Well, they wanted to leave it to China to invade Australia 80 years on.
Probably, yes. But they were going to cut trade off to Australia. They were going to make it very difficult for Australia to get the supplies it needed even then, which was probably New Guinea's a bit smarter place to take over. And Germany had a historic claim. Japan had a historic claim to it as well. How valid these were is for another podcast. But it turns out Australia would have done very badly had the Americans not come into World War II, and that's all very great. We then helped them in the next 7 or 8 wars they held. Korea, didn't end up so well. It wasn't a loss. Vietnam, which we don't talk about, except we do, except we don't, except we do. The various Gulf wars, Afghanistan, which I think is Australia's longest overseas incursion, Afghanistan. Certainly America's, 25 years. And we helped, that goes back to 19th century thinking with the Great Game and all of that. But we helped America there, not because it had any geopolitical strategic advantage to us, but because America was an ally. And if they go in, we better go in and help them. Otherwise, they might think we're not allies. And then, of course, the various Gulf Wars in which we've had even less need nor necessity to be there.
Well, I guess that's that's looking at the military side of things.
Yeah.
And it's obvious that there's this strong link between the United States and the Australian military system and hardware.
Sure.
I guess it's that issue about, well, how else will the United States dictate Australian policies like environment or health or education? We've seen that there's been interference in Australian political affairs in the past, but it's just a question of how much interference will the Australian public tolerate. They might accept the military side of things, but when that incursion starts going into other areas, I think that there will be quite a bit of blowback towards that.
Yeah. You can only push a citizenry so far, I think, before you start to get polling blowback. And yes, Labor is in an extremely good position, but as we've examined in other podcasts and in articles, the position is only good because it's better than what the Liberal Party is in. But when you break it down to solid figures, it's not that good. And when they lose power, we will see, I think, something similar to what's happening now with the Liberal Party.
There's also a wide range of other issues that we're jumping around a little bit at the moment, but I think a lot of these issues are flowing into these United States and Israel attacks on Iran directly and indirectly. And we've talked a lot about this over the past few weeks, David, but that stifling of public dissent around the discussions of Israel and Palestine. And I guess that because Israel is now attacking Lebanon and Iran, debate around those countries is probably going to be stifled by the government as well. And we had that ridiculous situation during the week where a mural that was created by the artist Nordacious had a Queensland police order implemented for it to be removed. And we're on a podcast, so I'll have to describe what it actually is. But the mural is of John Farnham, Australian icon, great singer, all of that sort of stuff. And it also includes the lyrics from one of his songs that was written in 1988. And the lyrics are the river to the sea. So that's gone up on this mural. And making that statement in Queensland will land you in jail for 2 years, and apparently it's not suitable for Queenslanders.
If that messaging is out there, there's no place in Queensland for that. That's not who we are.
So that was the Queensland Police Commissioner. So I'm not sure if they're actually going to go for John Farnham, the Australian icon, singer. You know, he's also, poor guy's had mouth cancer recently, so I hope they leave him alone. But the issue is, David, that this is so stupid that, you know, you have to laugh at it. Not if he gets you 2 years in jail, that's not a laughing matter. But these laws are so stupid. And you just have to wonder, how much is the Zionist lobby in Australia paying the Liberal Party to enact these stupid laws in Queensland? It must be a large sum, because no one introduces such stupid laws unless they've been paid a handsome sum. And this follows on from that influence from the United States that we talked about before. This is the sort of ridiculous legislation that's enacted within quite a few states within the United States. Britain also had those Palestine action laws, and the British High Court saved the government from itself by throwing out these laws to say, look, that's unconstitutional and that's overreach, so you can't have these laws. But I think that when you have these sort of ridiculous laws, people are going to push back. You know, they're going to push back against this sort of stuff. They're going to put up murals which include From the River to the Sea. They'll include John Farnham in there as well. They'll start wearing the T-shirts with From the River to the Sea. They'll start saying it in podcasts, which is what we've been doing for some time, From the River to the Sea, or Globalise the Intifada, or whatever else. We're just going to keep saying that because it's just so ridiculous. And there'll always be these small acts of resistance to stop these stupid laws. And that's what's happened in Queensland.
There's really three untouchable figures in Australian music. Olivia Newton-John, who I wrote somewhere, could shoot someone in Martin Place in Sydney in peak hour and the police would arrest the victim for stealing Olivia's bullets and make them pay her back. Kylie Minogue and John Farnham.
Not AC/DC?
AC/DC are a bit bigger again.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's make it easy. Four figures. Of course, AC/DC, by reputation, if you started on them, they will start back. But there are certain figures who, and John Farnham is a magnificent singer. There's no question of his talent. But his songs aren't.
The voice.
Yeah, the voice. His songs aren't, he's not Phil Oakes or early Bob Dylan, or his songs aren't overtly political. Two Strong Hearts is a love song. It might be a bit cheesy, it might be a bit corny, but it's sung with conviction, it's sung well, all of that. The River to the Sea rhymed with honey to the bee and mountain to the tree, or forget the other one.
That probably sounds a bit anti-Semitic as well, David.
Doesn't it? But it probably tells you how much the song would offend anyone who's not demented in their view of the world. Yeah, and someone who works in the music industry, I'm not here to run John Farnham down at all. I do think he's terrific, and we wish him well with his ongoing health issues. But it does show just how far some people will go to push a point. And I think it isn't an excuse to try and ramp up anti-Semitism, because pro-Semites as opposed to anti-Semites, there'd be some of them who say, this is stupid. What type of a people does this? And of course, then you get normal non-Zionist Jewish people starting to get anti-Semitic behaviour against them.
But the other thing is that this mural will now be recorded as an anti-Semitic event.
Yeah. From one of the most inclusive, welcoming acts we've ever had, and one of the most popular acts. And, okay, the artist took it out and gave it a new context. But that's what art is for too. If you can't critique the art for what it is, you don't have much of an argument. Oh yeah, we've got to ban this. And it's the first resort of the fascist, the authoritarian, the totalitarian, the extreme communist. I don't like it, so I'm going to ban it. We're not going to discuss it. I'm not going to tell you why I don't like it. I just don't like it. It's Stalin with non-Russian music. It's Hitler with non-German music. It's Kim Jong-un with whatever's going up there in North Korea. It's Saddam Hussein. It's Idi Amin, the last king of Scotland. It's just, it doesn't hold up to sustained thinking. And anything that doesn't hold up to sustained thinking should be rejected.
Today at the National Press Club, Israel's ambassador to Australia, Hillel Newman. Ambassador Newman has previously served as senior policy advisor to
The
Israel's parliament.
National Press Club hosted the Israeli ambassador this week, Hillel Newman. You referred to this address before, David, and this is the same National Press Club that cancelled the US journalist Chris Hedges last year. And at that point, Chris Hedges was going to appear at the National Press Club and tell the truth about the actions of Israel in Gaza, but that was too much for the National Press Club. So instead of having Chris Hedges telling the truth, they decided to have the Israeli ambassador telling absolute lies. And Ambassador Newman was given a platform to tell lie after lie after lie after lie, and then he lied some more. And of course, there was an excuse for everything that Israel has done over the past 80 years or so, including this biggest lie of all.
Gaza. Numbers are released into the news. Genocide in Gaza. There was no genocide in Gaza. According to the figures of Hamas, which are unreliable and we have no trust in the figures of Hamas, right? According to Hamas, 70,000 were killed. Hamas doesn't make any distinction between combatants and uninvolved civilians. So when you hear 70,000, the world thinks uninvolved, innocent civilians, 70,000 were killed. It's not true. There's a clear distinction, first of all, one must make a clear distinction between those that were combatants and those that were uninvolved civilians. There's make a distinction. If you want to accuse Israel of the numbers and say there was a genocide in Gaza, then you should look into how many were killed by Israel and how many were killed by Palestinian terrorism. There was no genocide in Gaza. The numbers do not depict what people on the streets think, because they don't look into the numbers and they don't understand the meaning of the numbers.
Now, David, there were just too many lies in that address to fit onto our weekly podcast, so we published the article on our website, newpolitics.com.au. A bit of cross-promotion going on here, but the article is the 12 big mistruths of Israeli diplomacy. So you can go and check that out on our website, newpolitics.com.au. And the lies from the ambassador, well, they were just coming thick and fast over. We could have actually done a live fact check and we'd still be running 4 days later. Now, as bad as all of that was, he was given a platform by the National Press Club, and you can say, well, okay, fair enough. He's the ambassador. You never know what he's going to say, even though you can probably have a pretty good guess, but let's get this guy up. But if you're going to give this guy a platform, it was a combination of Pik Botha from apartheid South Africa and Goebbels from the Third Reich. Now, if you're going to have this sort of person
and
up
Chemical
there...
Ali. Too.
Yeah, Chemical Ali. Yeah, it's a combination of the three of them. But if you're going to have this sort of person platformed at your location, at your venue, well, you ask them the hard questions. You're a press club. Ask the hard questions. You interrogate this guy. And there were a couple of tough questions from some of the journalists, maybe one or two, about the murder of so many journalists in Gaza and of the killing and murder of aid worker Zomi Frankham. But it was pretty light on, essentially. So we had a good example of how weak the mainstream media journalists are in Australia. So, like I said, there were one or two questions, but every single question should have pointed out all of these inaccuracies. But we pointed this out last year, David, but the National Press Club is sponsored by companies that are in the military industry or who have got links with the military industry. But this was more like a propaganda club, not a press club. And I think that the National Press Club, well, it needs to be castigated for inviting this guy to speak in the first place, but more importantly, not calling him out on his many, many lies. That's the more important issue.
Yeah, and that's what is appalling, that you have a room full of presumably and allegedly Australia's best journalists, and apart from those few notable exceptions, no one says, well, hold on, it's not hard to get. Amnesty International and every genocide expert in the world has called it a genocide. Actually, I think not everyone, but most genocide experts in the world have called it a genocide. How can you say it's not? And maybe he can say they were wrong because there's this actual checkable piece of data that nobody knows. But it's here and we can see from this. I'm not saying that would happen, but and when they get rid of Hedges and David Marr pretty much ruins his reputation, certainly damages it a lot by trying to show why the press gallery was right to sack him, but in fact shows why the press gallery have no idea what they were doing. It was very disappointing. I'd long admired David Marr's work, but all heroes disappoint. Really, we sent home the Iranian ambassador on very spurious and unclear grounds.
Well, they sent the wrong guy home. Really?
Yeah, this is the guy they probably should have sent home till Israel or the Israeli government wakes up to itself and starts to act like the Western democracy we're told it really is, the only democracy in the Middle East, which is garbage in itself. And of course, the other thing too is that by criticising one side doesn't mean that you fully approve of everything the other side does. Nonetheless, if we look at the amount of good that immigrants from the Middle East have done in Australia, it's been by far a much more positive and productive citizenry than not. And so when we allow this type of propaganda through, what are we saying to that section of the population? It's very distressing in many ways, because we have a lot of very fine people from the Middle East who when we hear that there's no genocide, what does this say to our citizens who happen to be of that background? And if he got up and said the Scots are a brawling, drunkard bunch of criminals who have no right to live in Australia, we'd have been rightly outraged. And hello to all our people of Scottish descent.
Or if he said the Croatian people in Australia are all very bloodthirsty and angry people. Which is just not true. I can vouch for that, David.
Yeah, no, I know. But it's absolutely correct. The Vietnamese, the Chinese, that we can go on and on. To tell lies that affect not just foreign affairs, but vital and important members of our society, to let them go pretty much unchallenged was appalling. And maybe it's time to scrap the National Press Club and to scrap the press gallery and go back to genuine outsiders trying to get the stories and actually having to work rather than be fed soft interviews and press releases.
And in Australia, David, there's a proposal that's been presented to the Australian government to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism across the public service. And I think that this is a real problem. Now, you don't want people within the public service having their personal political views influence government decision making, but overall, generally, policy development should be frank and fearless. And this whole proposal is trying to blur that link between genuine anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of Israel. And if you've got public servants, especially senior ones, not being able to advise or formulate foreign policy, for example, because it might be deemed to be offensive to the state of Israel, well, that's not going to end up with clear and effective foreign policy or any other area, like if it goes into health or education. Like education is one thing that they wanted to have a look at as well. And I think generally the public thinks that when what is said by political leaders in public forums and press media releases and all that sort of stuff, that comes directly from the political leaders, especially when it comes to foreign affairs. But most of what political leaders say actually comes from their advisors and from senior public servants. So what this will do, if it does go ahead, is that a lot of material will be censored before it even gets to the mouth of the foreign minister or education minister or prime minister or health minister, whoever. And I think it will just even further reduce the criticism of Israel by the Australian government. And I think that there's an interesting contrast with the past where political leaders were they were more open about the interference of the state of Israel in Australian politics. Here's Gough Whitlam speaking in 1985 at a book launch.
On page 125 in your discussion of international affairs, you have a reference to Australia's role in the Security Council of the United Nations during the 1973 Middle East War.
Yeah.
And you say there that Sir Lawrence McIntyre was president of the Security Council when the war broke out. And you say that political pressure and even blackmail was brought to bear on you and your government. But despite that, you gave him every support. What was the blackmail? How was it exercised? And who was responsible for it?
The blackmail was exercised by some heroes in the Australian Jewish community on the other side of the world from the hostilities, that we should support Israel in the dispute between Israel and its neighbours. And of course, my government at least pursued the expressed policy of all Australian governments to be neutral in those disputes and to take all steps available to Australia in resolving those disputes. And it would have been an appalling thing for us to come down on the side of, on one side, at the time that an Australian was in the key position of President of the Security Council. Now, if I may enlarge on this, since then, people in Australia should realise that there are now as many Arabs as Jews in Australia. There are as many Muslims as Jews. And we want everybody in Australia, of whatever racial origin, of whatever religious persuasion, to live in harmony and fruitful cooperation in this country of their adoption or their birth. And
Now, Gough Whitlam was 10 years out of office when he made those comments all the way back in 1985. But, David, I cannot imagine any leader, Anthony Albanese, or certainly not Chris Minns or David Crisafulli, making those sort of comments today. Former New South Wales Premier Bob Carr, well, he's been a bit more outspoken about the involvement of the Israel lobby in Australia, but he's been out of politics for 13 years or whatever it is. Now, we might end up getting something from Anthony Albanese when he's speaking from his nursing home in about 30 years' time, maybe not. But I just think that this influence has to be addressed. You cannot have these unelected representatives coming to the federal government or any government at all and just saying, look, this is what we are going to introduce. This is what we want you to implement. This is coming from the Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism, Gillian Siegel. You cannot have this situation. This influence just has to be removed.
No, I'd have thought that her role would have been more explaining clearly what anti-Semitism is to community groups, to public groups, and making sure that people aren't being genuinely anti-Semitic, but in a way that almost subconscious way. Instead, it seems that she's unfit for the job. I think that's very clear. There's way too many conflicts of interest. Her husband donating $50,000 to Advance. I'd have felt the same if he donated $50,000 to the Greens or to our friends at the Australian Democrats or to the Young Socialists. Not only should you be apolitical as much as you can in these types of roles, you should be seen to be apolitical. And yes, it's a husband, but $50,000 seems to me to be, it's not as if he gave them $200 at the end of a boozy lunch without really thinking about it, where you could say, okay, she's got nothing to do with that.
Oh, sure, but maybe no one is suitable for this position. The position shouldn't actually exist.
We do have a racial discrimination, which means that if you are of any race, you know that you've hopefully got good protection from the government. We have the anti-hate speech laws. I wish we didn't have them, but they're necessary. I wish we didn't have anti-murder laws either and anti-theft laws, but we need them because these things happen. When you start ranking prejudice, you end up in a far worse situation, and that's where we're headed. Is it more wrong to be anti-Jewish than it is to be anti-Palestine or anti-Muslim? It's exactly the same amount of wrong, very wrong. Is it more wrong to be anti-Korean than anti-Japanese or anti-French as opposed to anti-Spanish? How do we rank this stuff? And that's what the problem goes down to. And of course, given that there are lots of types of Jews, is it more wrong to be anti-Semitic Jewish or anti-Ashkenazi Jewish or anti-Ethiopian Falasha Jewish?
Or anti-Zionist Jewish.
Or anti-Zionist Jewish. Zionism being an idea rather than a group of people is okay. We can be anti-Zionist without being anti-Jewish, without being anti-Semitic. And as I think it's Michael's Curious World who comments on us, pointed out, Semitism is a language group, which includes Arabic and other. So the term anti-Semitic is problematic. What are we talking about? Again, everyone should be able to live here in peace and harmony and be able to live and work, practice their cultural beliefs unharmed and unscathed, provided all of that stuff doesn't undermine the Australian Constitution and the laws of Australia. And it doesn't. Kosher butchery isn't illegal, neither should it be. Halal butchery isn't illegal, or neither should it be. Dressing how you want, provided it maintains standards, communities.
Provided that you're wearing something.
Yes, something with some kind of decorum shouldn't be illegal. Gillian Segal seems to want to control things in a way that shouldn't be controlled. So, yeah, it's time to scrap the office, I think. They nearly did, apparently, and an opportunity was taken. Hasn't improved the position of the office.
So, David, we've sort of weaved our way through all of these different interlinked issues today, but I think the consistent issue is that Australia is starting to look more like the United States, not physically, but in our political thinking and in sort of foreign policy, our military, in terms of economics, public discourse, and what we're allowed to say about Israel or on Palestine, and in terms of dissent as well. And when the Labor Party officially declares that it's going to take a stronger stance against China, and it removes its opposition to mandatory detention, which is what they've actually proposed. That's what they've put within their national platform as well. When they start talking about these sorts of things, and remembering that the big American company Serco runs all of those detention centres, so the Labor Party is going to remove its opposition to mandatory detention. You're just wondering what's going on. But also, these are not small, tiny shifts. These are actually quite major changes. And Albanese, well, he made that national address. Donald Trump is doing one today as well. And I'm not suggesting that there's a correlation there, but it's starting to look very similar in behaviour. And ultimately, I think overall, it gets down to what sort of country does Australia want to be? Is it going to be literal America? Because that's certainly the way that it seems to be progressing at the moment. And ironically, it's a Labor government that seems to be finishing off this deal.
Arthur Colwell was a huge fan of the United States.
Well, most Labor leaders are. Like most of them, like Bob Carr or Kim Beazley.
Yeah. There's that group used to be in state Labor who would meet every so often and discuss the American Civil War in great details. And it was the 4th Pennsylvanians who came over the hill at this point in the battle, and they were led by General so-and-so, and they got 62% casualties and used these types of muskets. Intense level of detail.
Why are they discussing that? Why not discuss Pemulwuy or Jandamarra?
Yeah,
other local issues. Yes.
Interests are fine. Yeah, the Eureka Stockade. Having an interest completely separate to your daily work makes a lot of sense. But Labor's always had this obsession with the United States. Not all Labor people, of course. There are some who are very anti-US, but particularly Labor right. And, of course, Labor members have expressed their admiration for various politicians, Liberal too, but it's a bit more notable, I think that's the word I'll use, coming from Labor members. There are those who think that Richard Marles is too close to the United States, and I'm not going to go too much into that because I think we've discussed it in the past. And yeah, I think just to note that everyone listening knows what I'm talking about, I think. And if they don't, please comment and we'll fill it out in the comments, as it were. He's not the only one, of course, who's very close to figures and organisations in the United States, but he's the most prominent. So, yeah, Labor does have a historic, and of course, it's spelt Labor with an O, because King O'Malley, who was Canadian if he'd been born 50 miles further north, argued that American influence would be such that we'd be adopting American spelling back in 1902 or something. There's a very long tradition of pro-American Labor.
But David, should there be a bit of a gap there? Should there be more of a distance?
I guess you could liken it to the car executive who works for car company A but drives car brand B on the weekend. What's going on there? And that's where we have to be careful. And we're never going to, if you're into politics, you're going to find the American presidency fascinating and the secretaries of state. I do too. You're also going to find the British Prime Ministers, New Zealand, the Brazilian structure, the Puerto Rican structure, that state maybe not so much, it's getting into the nitty-gritty of stuff. The Peruvian structure, depending on your interests, your background, your intellectual pursuits. It's not so much that, it's when it gets to the point where you're starting to impinge on Australian interests that it becomes a problem.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you value independent journalism without the influence of corporate backing, join New Politics at newpolitics.com.au and support us directly. It's just $5 per month, and we always try to keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.